Well, hello there. Now today I'll be supporting the resolution that rapists should be allowed to opt into castration in exchange for a lesser prison sentence. A couple of definitions to start out with. Rapists are sexual intercourse, and castration we're going to be talking about in this round is chemical castration, or offering a cocktail of chemicals that reduces someone's sexual drive. Now, in order to kind of understand this resolution a little bit more, let's talk about the plan, or basically I'm offering a plan for how this is going to be implemented. That is that we're allowing judicial discretion in cases where castration may reduce likelihood of further sexual offense to give that option to rapists. Now, why on earth would we decide to do this or not to do this? That's where our weighing mechanism comes in. I believe you should make the decision for this round based on the value of safety. Now, safety is basically one of the biggest reasons that we put people in prison. We intend prison as a way to deter crime or to incapacitate an offender so that he can't commit crimes at that time. And so when we're talking about releasing a prisoner from society, we need to analyze whether it makes society safer or not. That's a big thing. So let's talk now about what castration does to actually affect that. Now, I'm going to have two big points today. First, we're going to talk about the current use of this. Now, currently, 9 states allow chemical castration as an alternative to prison. Florida allows surgical castration as an alternative to prison. Argentina, Poland, the United Kingdom, Russia, Germany, the Czech Republic, Estonia, and the Republic of Korea allow chemical castration. Germany allows surgical castration. That's according to the India Express and according to CNN. So this is currently something that's actually going on. And with that in mind, we actually can look at some empirics and some studies on what happens when we allow this option. So let's talk about that in my second point, that of the empirics. Now I'm going to be talking about a few countries that have actually implemented this and some studies that have happened that show that people who undergo chemical castration actually do have lower rates. Now, to start out with, some of my studies actually study surgical castration as an option. But according to Fred Berlin, who's an associate professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins, surgical and chemical castration have basically the same effects on recidivism because they have basically the same effects on the person involved. The only difference is that chemical castration is reversible. So let's talk now about a couple countries. Now, I don't have much time, so we're going to just talk about one for now. That's that of Norway. A 1959 study studied castrated individuals and found that although they had 58% of them were prior offenders and 34% had multiple prior offenses, they only had a 2.9% recidivism rate, and 66% of them lost all sexual interest after the incident, after being released. I'll have plenty more empirics, which I'll bring up later in the round, but I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic so you can introduce your own position.
Well, thank you for that. I agree with basically everything you said there, and yet I have a very different perspective on this resolution. My problem with this resolution is not the idea of chemical castration. I agree with you that historically, we've seen a ton of success with this. The statistics tend to show somewhere between the rate of recidivism starts at 75% without chemical castration and then goes down to 2% with chemical castration. I'm just going to follow up on that a little bit here because Depo-Provera is the drug that is commonly administered. It can be taken through tablets or through injections. And what it does is it helps to limit the desires of the person taking them toward sexual deviancies or toward their sex drive in general. It's been estimated to take about 65% of their sex drive down, which helps to make their desires more manageable. Now, where I have a difference of opinion from you in this resolution is that what I disagree with on the resolution is that I do not believe that rapists should be allowed to opt into this program. It should not be a voluntary program, nor should it be given in response for a lesser prison sentence. So I have 3 overall responses to those points. My first response is that it is unjust. My opponent is confusing the idea of rehabilitation and punishment. Punishment is what the state does as an attempt to restore justice to the victim. It is an attempt to give back to that victim for what they have suffered through. If we lessen the prison sentence, we are not actually hurting the offender. We are hurting the victim, removing that benefit that had been given to them. She argued, usually it's a her, but they argued in court asking for a punishment. If we lessen that punishment, we are hurting the victim. This is incredibly unjust and must be rejected. It is not an option in this round. My second response to his overall perspective is that it is insolvent. The way my opponent is doing this is he's letting rapists choose if they want to enter into this on their own. But I don't think this will work at all, because most of them would not choose it, even if they were offered a lesser prison sentence. So my third and overall point is that of a different solution. The way we should do this, he pointed out there are 9 states that already have laws on the books. For instance, the one that I want to look at most is California. In California, the way we do it is after a first offense, the judge has the ability to order the person to take these drugs. After a second offense, they are then forced to take the drugs no matter what. It is not an opt-in system. It is not offered in response to a lesser amount of prison time. It is mandatory. In this way, we are able to solve better than what my opponent is doing. So this is the stance that I'm going to advocate in this round, that it should be mandatory and should not be lessened for prison sentence.
Okay, so I'm glad we can agree on the fact that it actually does improve safety for the people involved. I have a lot more empirics I was ready to bring up if you're going to disagree with that point. But let's actually talk about the points you did bring up, starting with your first point that it's unjust. Now, I'm going to have 2 responses to this. First, castration is a form of retribution. It actually is punishment because it does remove an offender's ability to experience a sexual drive and some of the pleasure involved in that thing. Secondly, neither of these situations, either prison time or castration, inherently affects the victim. Now, you're talking about this whole idea that prison time is some kind of response to the victim, which gives them some kind of satisfaction involved in that. Now, as I've already implied, castration is a form of retribution. But besides this, neither of them actually have any measurable impact on the victim's welfare or the victim's life. Whether you put them in prison or chemically castrate the person involved, it's not going to do anything for the victim. The only thing that actually does that is restorative justice or restitution, and that's an entirely different form of punishment. Secondly, the point of that it's insolvent. My response is the empirics. Now, we have empirics about about these European countries and states that actually allowed people to opt into castration, and plenty of them did it. We see a lot of them happening in Norway. The study specifically took 216 individuals. Germany, they studied 1,000 individuals. Switzerland, they studied 127 individuals. And in California, in one of the studies that actually was reported to the California subcommittee in the legislature, they saw 60 individuals. And these are only subsets of the individuals who've actually chosen castration. They're the people that they chose to study. So there is plenty of evidence that people will opt into this program. And thirdly, the idea that there's a different solution. I'm going to have 2 responses to this point. First is that it's unconstitutional. Now, there have been 2 different constitutional rights that this violates. You first talk about the cruel and unusual punishment point of the 8th Amendment. Now, to actually remove someone's sexual drive forcefully would probably be held to be a violation of this right, this cruel and unusual punishment. Secondly, it violates someone's right to have children. Now, there's actually considered a right to procreate within the 14th Amendment by the court. So what this does, when you're giving this chemical castration, it really does reduce the right to procreate. So that would actually be a violation of rights, and it would be held unconstitutional if there actually was a force involved here. Secondly, I was going to talk about this more generally than just constitutionally. It is a violation of your rights. Now, we do recognize that prisoners, although they have done a lot of horrible things, do have rights. And one of them is to actually have bodily integrity. And you can't have a standing, when this is done voluntarily, there's absolutely no challenge to this idea of rights. That's according to Lawrence H. Tribe, who's a professor at Harvard Law. But when you do this forcefully, there's a very real case to be made that a prisoner's rights are being violated. His right to bodily integrity, his right to have children, his right to experience pleasure in the sex drive. And I think that's a big issue. So I'm going to go ahead and pass them.
Okay, so I'm glad that we agree on the overall perspective. So the question in this round is which of us can better affect safety for the people? My opponent is only able to obtain this for the people who voluntarily choose to take these drugs, as opposed to my case, which is to require that they take these drugs, which is what the California model already is and the one that we should be pushing further in this round. Now, he responded to my point about it being unjust by saying that castration is punishment and that it doesn't affect the victim. I have 3 responses to this. My first response is no, it is rehabilitation. It is necessary to understand that these drugs are different than an actual punishment in and of themselves. The prison time is the punishment. The drugs are part of the rehabilitative aspect. That's why they are accepted. That's why they're constitutional. That because it is part of rehabilitation, it's part of treatment. They've been upheld in courts because they are rehabilitation, they are treatment. They are not intended to be part of the punishment. If my opponent wants to call them punishment, that is when they actually become unconstitutional. This is why what the courts have upheld is that you have to have it incorporated with other treatments, with psychological treatments as well, because it's part of their rehabilitation. It's intended to help the people be able to be functioning members of society. My second response is that it is a response to the victim. He's acting like taking away the prison sentence is not actually beneficial to the victim or doesn't affect the victim. Well, the victim pushed for this. The reason they brought it to court was because they were looking for justice. If you remove the amount of penalty that was given, which is prison time, it's not castration, it's prison time, you are inherently devaluing what the victim went through. My third response is that of bargaining power. Why are we giving bargaining power to rapists to say, all right, I will take these drugs if you get rid of my prison sentence? They have all the power in that bargaining. They can say, all right, you have to get rid of 20 years of my prison sentence or else I don't take the drugs. Why not just mandate it like California already has done? Now, he responded by talking about European countries as his proof that it's solvent. My response is that of voluntary versus mandatory. Yes, European countries, the ones who have voluntarily chosen to do it, it's worked for them. But it hasn't worked across the board because many of them don't actually do it. Let's contrast this with California, which is where it has been tried. In 1996, when it was first put in, the California Department of Justice saw that there was a recidivism rate of 50% to 80% between 1 and 2 years. As of 2016, after the policy was implemented, it is 4.8%. It works when we require it across the board. That is what I'm advocating in this round. His response of unconstitutional is actually inaccurate because there's no actual court cases that he's presented on this. These books have been on the books for 20 years, and there hasn't ever been a single court case challenging that. There have been other types of court cases that sort of mention it, but it has never been struck down.
Okay, so let's talk about these issues. Starting off with the point about it's unjust. Now, my opponent says that it is rehabilitative, but I don't see how it's inherently rehabilitative to take away someone's ability to have a sexual drive. That doesn't really make sense. That's a form of punishment. It could be considered part of rehabilitation as well, but if you look at the 5 classical purposes of punishment, rehabilitation, retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and restitution, rehabilitation is actually part of punishment. Like, we teach people how to do things in prison in order to rehabilitate them, as well as simply to incapacitate them, deter them, or face retribution. He then says it's the response to the victim. Now, I've already explained why this is, in fact, a form of punishment. But also, I don't see that it's inherently any worse than leaving them in prison, because the victim didn't ask that just, you have to have 20 years in prison. The victim just wants them to be punished. And if it is punishment, if it actually causes them suffering, then I see that this still does respond to the victim. His third point about the bargaining power, my response is judicial discretion. Now, judicial discretion is when the judge is just saying, okay, I'm deciding your sentence, you can have this option, and your sentence will then be this. So the judge is ultimately making them decide. They aren't getting bargaining power. The judge is deciding for them. That's the plan I laid out. Secondly, he says it's insolvent, and he talks about how it's voluntary versus mandatory. Now, I'm going to talk about the whole mandatory thing and why that's a problem in just a minute under his different solution argument. But my response to this whole idea is just that it maintains rights. Now, we have all these systems, and we all tend to recognize that there's an inherent value in human rights. That's why we have the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so we have to recognize there are human rights here. And so I'm going to talk about this in my response to his third point about why we really we shouldn't be allowed to have this mandatory system because it violates their rights. And so he says then that under this third system that there's no violation of human rights because there hasn't been a court case about it. Now, I already brought up the quote from Lawrence H. Tribe, who is a professor at Harvard Law and one of the preeminent constitutional experts in our society. And he says that if it's actually mandatory, castration in any form is mandatory, there's a very real standing for a legal challenge. There hasn't been one yet, but what we don't see is the fact that it's actually clearly constitutional or that it's not a violation of your rights. Now, if you're taking away somebody's ability to procreate and arguably giving them cruel and unusual punishment, there's very real ground for a legal challenge there. And so I don't see this as a really big, really actually an impactful argument. Just because there hasn't been one yet doesn't mean there will be. And on the face, it appears, to me at least, that if there is a salute challenge, that it'll be a hard-fought fight, but I think at the end, it's going to show you that it is unconstitutional. I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic now.
All right, so we're going to look at a couple of legal studies. First, from the New England Journal on Criminal and Civil Confinement, saying, quote, "The third prong of the Rennie test requires that the side effects of treatment must not be unnecessarily harsh in relation to the treatment's benefits. While studies on chemical treatment have concluded that the treatment does cause some side effects, these side effects generally have not appeared to be particularly serious or persistent. Furthermore, if the treatment results in lower recidivism rates, it is arguable that the side effects are outweighed by the treatment's benefits." The University of Pepperdine Law Review also agrees, saying, quote, "Chemical castration is clearly a less painful and intrusive penalty than these accepted alternatives. Because California's mandatory chemical castration satisfies the relevant inquiries under the Eighth Amendment, the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment should not bar the operation of this law." End quote. You can see this all over the place. When we look into the different laws that already are on the books, none of them have been stricken down. None of them have even been brought up in court. They don't even get legally challenged because it already is accepted that it is part of treatment. And this is where we have a clear difference between my opponent and I. My opponent seems to think that taking these drugs is supposed to be a punishment. That's actually not the way it is intended. The punishment is the prison time. The rehabilitation, the ability for them to go back into the world, is part of society protecting ourselves and helping the offenders themselves. In fact, the offenders often find that these are incredibly helpful to them. A sex addict explained on New York Magazine that, quote, "Before I went on these drugs, I was thinking about having sex over 30 times a day. After 6 months, I would only have the thoughts a few times a day. It had become a cycle I couldn't escape. When I wanted to have sex, it was like a drug addiction. Now I can see that I was constantly chasing that high. It was part of the excitement, and as soon as it was over, I was miserable. But now, I feel fantastic." Another sex offender says, "I realized that I could walk down the street, see boys I found sexually attractive, and not be possessed by thoughts about having sex with them. It took that edge off." Overall, what we have to understand here is that the chemical castration itself is simply taking drugs that help to limit the sex drive to a manageable amount. It has been deemed constitutionally acceptable. It has not been challenged in courts because it is intended as treatment. It is a help, a benefit to these people. So we have to understand that there is a difference between the punishment itself, which is the prison time, and that is intended to be a response of justice for the prior victims, versus the rehabilitation elements, which is how do we make it so that society can be safe with these people back on the streets. Now, my opponent agrees that chemical castration is a great way to do this. We've seen that it is constitutionally acceptable. We've seen that it's helpful to the offender as long as it is part of rehabilitation. We should do it in this manner, not as an optional.
Okay, so let's talk about this whole issue. Now, let's start talking first about the Rennie test, which my opponent brought up in his point. Now, the problem with the Rennie test is that he talked about California's current law facing this problem. And I'm looking at this article right now, which is from, excuse me, this article's from, sorry. Okay, well, the point is the Rennie test really fails, the California law fails the Rennie test because it doesn't actually establish a current psychotherapeutic program to help the offenders. Like, it's actually considered to be punishment under the Rennie test because instead of actually establishing a rehabilitative program, it simply gives the drugs. And the Rennie test requires that in order for a program to be considered actually rehabilitative, it actually requires psychotherapeutic treatment. So the California law, which does not actually include this, would probably most likely fail the Rennie test. So the California law that my opponent is talking about would most likely fail the test that he actually brought up to describe it as passing this and showing that it would pass Eighth Amendment scrutiny. My opponent's next point was basically talking about how prison time is justice and this is rehabilitation. Now, the problem with this argument is that it really ignores the points that I've already been bringing up. The fact that this is, in fact, at least partly punishment, and the fact that punishment does and can include rehabilitation. I brought up the 5 purposes of punishment: deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, restitution. Sorry, and did I say rehabilitation already? Deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, retribution, and restitution. Okay, got it all. So what that basically means is that any form of punishment can and should include rehabilitation as part of it. So what we're talking about here is like a 2-pronged punishment. Like, there's both a rehabilitative and a retributive aspect to it. the chemical castration does cause suffering and can like remove and limit someone's potential. And that is actually a form of punishment. But also it provides some rehabilitative aspects. So what we really see here is that the chemical castration, I think, does violate people's rights. We've talked about the Constitution, but there's also just the human rights argument. What you're talking about here is forcing someone to be limited in their sexual drive, forcing someone to be limited in what they can do. Amnesty International actually pointed out, has taken a stand against chemical castration. They say it's a violation of people's human rights, that when, especially when it's mandatory. It is a violation of your human rights when you're forced to undergo it. The common sense solution, which would avoid any kind of legal challenge, is to have the people involved make the decision for themselves. And that's why rapists need to be given the option rather than being forced into it. I'm going to pass the mic.
Here's the problem. When you give them the option, they don't take it. We haven't ever seen any statistics on how many of them voluntarily choose to do this, because it isn't something that they would inherently want to do on their own. But after it becomes a mandatory thing for them, they find that it is incredibly helpful and beneficial to them. But off the bat, when they first hear it, they don't want to do it. My opponent has presented no studies on what a percent of amount that they would do if it's voluntary. Sure, a few people voluntarily do choose it, but it doesn't actually have the same benefits as if it is mandatory, which is what California law was able to do. Let's go back to those numbers. Since California implemented its policy in 1996, the rate of recidivism has gone down. It was 50% after 1 year and 80% after 2 years of sexual reoffenders committing the same crime again. Today, after this policy has been implemented, it is at 4.8%. It is incredibly beneficial. Meanwhile, there has never been a constitutional challenge to it because it wouldn't work. Because and his response to this was to talk about how California's law didn't have a psychotherapeutic element involved in it. That is true. However, that was when it was first created. Since then, we have had different variants of the ability to help the sex offenders, and it has actually been advocated for in California. That's also what I'm advocating for. I'm saying that it needs to be seen as rehabilitation. It needs to have that therapeutic element as well. And I'm not the only one who agrees with this. Susan North of the California Psychiatric Association approved of the California law and was part of the ones who was urging for the increase in the psychological aspect, saying, quote, "You also have to get inside some people's minds with counseling to move along the corrective action, which is chemical castration. You have to make them want to stop in their hearts what it is they do, otherwise they are not likely to stop in the end. You have to work with some people both before they are released and after they are released," end quote. So yes, my opponent is correct that it does need to include the therapeutic element, which is what we are going to focus on in this round. Now, the question of the round is, should rapists be allowed to opt into it and get a lesser prison sentence, or should it be mandatory? I'm advocating that it should be mandatory, and we've seen studies on the numbers of how far this has been brought down specifically with a similar sort of program to what I'm saying. The reason for this is because we focus on it as rehabilitation. Even in the studies he's talking about from Europe, those are the ones that also had it focused as rehabilitation. You cannot focus on it as punishment, because if you do, it doesn't end up working. That's why the studies that I'm talking about are talking about how it needs to be seen as separate from the punishment itself. Now, he also talked about how punishment serves 5 purposes. I would agree that there is certain elements of being forced to take the drugs that would be punishment, but that's not the purpose of why we take it, why we have them take it. The reason why we have these people take the drugs is because it helps them and it helps society. That's the ultimate goal here.
Okay, so I'm going to briefly go over the points that we've brought up. Let's start talking about the whole idea that if they don't give the option, they won't choose to take it. Now, currently, I didn't find any statistics on how likely they were to take the challenge, just because there wasn't really any research that I found about that. But we did find that hundreds of offenders were taking those, and they were taking them willingly. So the studies I'm talking about in Europe actually did show that people are taking that, and they are actually voluntarily becoming chemically castrated. Secondly, he talks about the whole legal challenge, and he says basically that it hasn't been challenged in court yet. Now, I've brought up a couple of legal experts that basically say that if it is challenged, there's a very good case that it could be overturned. And I talked about first Lawrence H. Tribe, also John F. Stiniford, a visiting professor of law, University of St. Thomas School of Law, Minneapolis, Minnesota. So these people are actually writing entire articles or commenting in news articles about how if it's mandatory, it could be overturned on constitutional grounds. So we've actually brought up legal experts talking about this. Just the fact that there hasn't been a court case yet doesn't mean that it is constitutional. He hasn't actually been challenged in court on it at all. Secondly, he says that the whole idea of rehabilitation has to be separate from punishment. And under this, he did concede that this whole idea of chemical castration does involve some forms of punishment. It does inflict some kinds of suffering, but he says that's not the purpose. My response is punishment has many purposes. I keep emphasizing this, but punishment is not only retributive in nature. It's also intended to help society by keeping us safe. That's what incapacitation, deterrence, and rehabilitation are all about. So this idea that punishment is just solely about creating suffering for suffering's sake is not true at all. So this whole idea that chemical castration is completely separate from punishment, again, fails because he fails to recognize what punishment is. And finally, he just says that chemical castration does help the offender in society. I completely agree. But because of the fact that it violates people's human rights, and I believe it also violates their constitutional rights, it needs to be something that we keep as a voluntary option. My opponent hasn't responded to the point I brought up from Amnesty International about how it does violate people's human rights, and he hasn't responded to the constitutional challenges, besides to say that there hasn't really been a court case yet. I don't think those are adequate justifications for assuming that it doesn't violate people's human rights. And so for that reason, I believe it needs to be a voluntary program. I'm going to pass the mic back now.
Okay, so the question that we have here is which one of us is able to better benefit safety? That's the value my opponent presented. That's the value we both agree on in this round. My opponent has presented examples of hundreds. That's the extent of what he can do. The ones who choose to go through this process, which is a few hundred, as opposed to me, who can solve 100%. Or, well, actually, excuse me, let me rephrase that. As the California model has shown, it went down to 4.8%. So I can solve about 95% of the violence against human beings. So when we talk about safety, my side is clearly upholding safety in a better way. The only question is whether or not this is going to be accepted and whether or not it is a human rights abuse. My response to this is that we've seen numerous times when if it is focused on rehabilitation, it is accepted both constitutionally and on a human rights perspective. This is why there has never been a court case. My opponent has never shown you a court case, or he's never shown you why there actually would be a court case. His only point is that if there was one, it might have a problem. But I've also shown you numerous law journals that have said it would succeed because it is focused on rehabilitation. Now, he talks about how punishment may have many purposes. This is true. But the thing here is that the reason these laws are successful is because they aren't focused on punishment anymore. They are focused on the rehabilitative aspects, which is why they are not a human rights abuse. It is an attempt to help people. It is an attempt to make them functioning members of society. This is why they often thank us for having these laws on the books, as I read a couple of examples of people who had been grateful for the fact that they were able to live normal lives because of this. So it is not a human rights abuse. When we distinguish between trying to punish people and hurt them, as opposed to trying to help them become functioning members of society, we see that this works, we see that it is constitutional, and on the value of safety, with the rate of recidivism is significantly lower when it is mandatory, because all of them must then take it, and it is then more beneficial in the long run.
Okay. So I'm going to wrap up now by talking about basically the only difference here between my opponent and my case is the idea that he suggested it has to be mandatory. Now, I've explained, quoting from several professional legal experts, like the most credible people in the field, saying that it likely would fail if there's an 8th Amendment challenge or even a 14th Amendment challenge. Now, he's quoted from a couple of law journals, but at the end of the day, I think that we can't conclude just from the fact that there hasn't been a challenge yet that it won't fail. We're talking about the most credible people in the field here. So ultimately, when we look at this issue, I believe that human rights is an essential part of safety. And the criminals, the prisoners, need to be just as safe in their human rights as everybody else does. Thanks.
All right, I showed you how, according to the Rennie versus Klein test, it would be upheld by the courts. I quoted you from numerous law journals and the Massachusetts state courts themselves, who all said that this was acceptable and that it would pass. Overall, we see that my plan is one that will have a significant advantage for safety versus my opponent's. Under my plan, we actually are able to solve the issue. Under his plan, it only works if they want it themselves. So I'm going to finish by quoting the Chapman Law Review, saying, lastly, and most important, chemical castration is constitutional. Chemical castration is the treatment to which we have been led after decades of recidivism and failed treatment for child molesters and pedophiles. This drug can give offenders a second chance at life and give children less to be afraid of in the world.